What dark facts about World War II people should know about? Japan performed horrific scientific experimentation on humans that killed roughly to 50K in Manchuria. You need 731 horrible stuff at it. Be warned, reading this will ruin your day. The Japanese called their prisoners' logs, removing all aspects of humanity when referring to them. Yep, the experiments were horrific. Live vivisection wasn't even the worst of it. It wasn't far off. The NS did to Belarus. They piled entire towns into churches and lit them on fire. They wiped out entire populations in hundreds of towns. They would also allow children to leave the church, seemingly sparing them, then they'd mow them down later after hearing their families screaming. People think Hitler was evil. Dirlewanger was practically the son of Satan. When normal people want to have fun with their friends, they go watch a movie. When Dirlewanger and his friends wanted to have fun, they injected Jewish women with strychnine and watched them convulse to death in unimaginable pain on the floor. Dirlewanger got in trouble by the NS for things he did during the war. Imagine that. The SS thinking you need to chill out on the evil deeds. I have never heard of Dirlewanger. Thanks for opening my eyes to this pile of refuse that wore a uniform. I heard of him on Behind the Rogues podcast, and man, that dude was effed up in the brain. The NS themselves had to tell this man to bring down a notch because he was that mental. Dr. Gisela Perl, a Hungarian gynecologist, was in Bergen-Belsen camp. She performed abortions with her bare hands in order to save their mothers' lives because she knew. Dr. Joseph Mengele loved to experiment on pregnant women. First you think, what an awfully cruel person, my goodness, she isn't the bad one. This is scraping the surface. Most of the atrocities performed by Mengele were by his Jewish assistants, because they were usually much better doctors. But it gave them access to information and resources that let them save dozens more lives off the clock for every atrocity they had to participate in. A very poor choice of words. The Dirlewanger Brigade, named after its commander Oskar Dirlewanger, consisted of convicted criminals who were not expected to survive their service with the unit during its operations. The unit participated in the mass murder of civilians and in other war crimes in German-occupied Eastern Europe. It gained a reputation among Wehrmacht and Waffen's officers for its brutality. Crimes included the mass RE and murder of 15 Red Cross nurses and the killing of thousands of civilians. After troops entered a makeshift military hospital, they first killed the wounded with bayonets and rifle butts before gang-raping the women. The naked bleeding nurses were then taken outside and hanged by their feet and shot in their stomachs. They were responsible for the Wola massacre, the mass killing of 40,000 Polish civilians. They were specifically ordered to kill everything that moved. Also, the man who ordered the massacre, Heinz Rienefarch, lived a peaceful and opulent life after the war. As a mayor of a small German town, he even won a case against some journalists who tried to bring his crimes to light, and requests from the Polish government for his extradition were rejected by West German authorities. Apparently, he worked for the CIC and was also not extradited by the US and later the Brits. Directly after WW2, why they did not do anything later is a joke though. He founded the local Lions Club on Silt. Lol. Who is that? The amount of acronyms I found of CIC was effing messed up, and I don't think it was Chemical Institute of Canada, or maybe it is, lol. Germany used prostitutes as bioweapons. Under their rule, any prostitutes who had STIs were imprisoned so they couldn't infect German troops. As Germany started to lose ground in occupied Europe, they would release all of the women in hopes of infecting Allied troops. TBH, I don't remember if this happened in WW1 or WW2. It could very well have been both. Definitely W2. The opposite happened in WW1. Especially the prostitutes with syphilis. They would charge double because syphilis was a ticket out of the trenches. Honestly, syphilis probably was preferable to being in a WW1 trench. Before they knew how to treat it, it would probably be more of a coin flip. Penicillin wasn't invented until 1928. Something you never hear about is what happened to displaced persons, or DP. Over 40 million people couldn't go back to where they originally lived. A lot of people were prevented from going back. A lot didn't want to go back. It's a fascinating story that doesn't get much coverage. There is an article on Wikipedia. My grandfather's job in Linz, Austria post-war was dealing with displaced persons. He was upset decades later that he hadn't believed Stalin would kill Soviet soldiers for having been posed, but Stalin did. My grandfather was an RN commando. He stormed the beaches, fought across Europe until he was injured and the war ended, went back to his normal job as a laborer for a construction company. One day a recruiter from the Merchant Navy came along and asked the foreman if anyone had any experience at sea. I think Ray was in the Navy. Any experience at sea, son? A few short trips across the channel. Laughs. Do you want to be a steward on refugee ships? And that's how he ended up seeing most of the world. Europe was desperate to spread as many people out as they could. My great-granddad, who passed away when I was 6, used to describe his role as a navigator on Wellingtons as very short holidays to Frankfurt. I was going to copy-paste this, but it's longer than I remembered, so have this link instead. There were mass REs followed by mass sides when the Russian army entered Germany. At least 2 million German women are believed to have been RE'd. It was said every woman from 8 to 80 years was RE'd by the Russian army. Yep. It's been largely ignored because no one was feeling particularly sympathetic towards the German people's plight following the war, but it happened and it was truly horrific. That it was, even the good guys in World War II were doing atrocious things. War is heck. War is heck, but you don't usually have RE at this level. 2 million women. JFC, it boggles the mind. And it's not taught or discussed. Heck. We have movies of the fed-up internment camps America kept its Asian population in, but no one has even touched this, at least no one high profile. I mean, RE and pillage isn't really a joke. That was the end result of war most of the time for most of history. A dozen department heads got together at a disloco to iron out the details of the Holocaust. It took less than 2 hours. A movie was made about it called Conspiracy. That movie is nuts because it's just reading off the transcripts from the actual meeting that someone kept in a file even though they were supposed to be destroyed. Highly recommend the movie to people. It's not nightmare-inducing or gore like some of the movies about the subject can be. Just chilling when you think about it deeply. It was part of a grad school curriculum for a public administration course that also included fog of war. Both go hand in hand in understanding that war and public administration from an ethical perspective. The justification for right and wrong and what it means to be part of a government machine. It also pointed out there were absolute psychopaths running the show on all sides. Curtis LeMay is one of the most disgusting individuals in history. Quote from Fog of War. Why was it necessary to drop the nuclear B if LeMay was burning up Japan? And he went on from Tokyo to fire other cities. 58% of Yokohama? Yokohama is roughly the size of Cleveland. 58% of Cleveland destroyed. Tokyo is roughly the size of New York. 51% of New York destroyed. 99% of the equivalent of Chattanooga, which was Toyama. 40% of the equivalent of Los Angeles, which was Nagoya. This was all done before the dropping of the nuclear B, which by the way was dropped by LeMay's command. Proportionality should be a guideline in war. Killing 50% to 90% of the people of 67 Japanese cities and then being them with 2 nuclear BS is not proportional. In the minds of some people, to the objectives we were trying to achieve, Lemay said. If we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. And I think he's right. And I'd say we're behaving as war criminals. Lemay recognized that what he was doing would be thought immoral if his side had lost. But what makes it immoral if you lose and not immoral if you win? Full Lemay quote, "Killing Japanese didn't bother me very much at that time. I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." This shouldn't take away from all the prior discussions regarding the atrocities committed by the Japanese. That was really terrible. This is just recognition that putting the wrong leaders at the top can really F everything up, regardless of how the majority of people think or feel. Part of the discussion in the class was whether any one individual was able to change or stop the machine once in motion. Once brutality becomes par for the course humanity and the idea of what is moral disappears and becomes more a suggestion than rule. This isn't saying moral from a religious standpoint, but rather the recognition that murder itself is wrong. When your leaders are out of their effing mind sadists, you're in for mass murder on the greatest of scales. I don't mean to pick at this, but it wasn't 50-90% of the population killed. It was 5,090% of the buildings destroyed. The damage and loss of life was immense, but it wasn't 90% of the population killed immense. The existence of Unit 731 and a lot of the other atrocities committed by Japan. It's a common answer on Reddit. But outside of our little echo chamber, most people are still totally unaware of just how horrific a lot of what Japan did was. A lot of what Japan did during WWI was every bit as bad as what the NS did. And in some instances, one could even argue that what they did was worse. There's a documentary where they interviewed former Japanese soldiers who admit to all the war crimes they committed, with no hint of remorse, as if it was any war story to tell your buddies at the bar. It's an extremely tough and disturbing watch to hear story after story of torture, cannibalization, and cruelty. I'm guessing that third vile act was them forcing the prisoners to do it. No, there was a Japanese officer who believed eating human liver had positive health benefits. Well, if that guy, hope he didn't live past the 40s. During the RE of Nanking, there was a contest between two Japanese officers to see who could decapitate the most people. I don't understand. I can usually put myself in people's shoes, but I literally cannot even get close to understand how anyone would want to do that. I get joining a war and fighting the enemy, because you're protecting your family and your land is at risk. I can also understand having so much hatred that you might kill the enemy. But to do this sort of thing to civilians, most people are not psychopaths. So how is it possible for so many people to join in and do this stuff? There must be studies or something, because it's so bad my brain refuses to believe it, even though I know that this indeed happened. At that time, Japanese had a mentality that they are the superior race and everyone else are maggots. It is still something that is ingrained in their society. Look at how foreigners are treated in Japan even in today's age from the older generation. It is still a very hard thing to gain residency and citizenship in Japan if you are a foreigner. Imperial Japan is what happens when you give a medieval society industrial tech without having them experience the societal progress that came with it. Perry opened Japan in 1853. 88 years later, they attacked Pearl Harbor. That's an absurd turnaround time historically speaking. Not really medieval society. State Shintoism is the culprit here. The Emperor of Japan was always seen as having divine ancestry, similar to pharaohs of Egypt or the old divine right of kings. When the shogunate lost power and the emperor took power, he took absolute control of the government. More similar to, say, pre-WW1 European monarchies. They specifically went out of their way to learn as much as they could from the rest of the world. They were not given it. They studied and innovated. The main difference to Western societies was that state Shintoism was introduced, which essentially dictated that because Japan was ruled by a living god, the Japanese people were inherently superior to other peoples. So you had a weird blend of European absolutism combined with a state that had no concept of separation of church from state, which still used divine right rather than power from the people, and every member of government was directly appointed by and answered to the emperor. I don't believe there has ever been a person in history as completely dominant in their society as the emperor was in early 19th, 20th century Japan. He completely controlled the government, the culture, the religion, and noon in the military would dare defy a direct order from their god, and dissent against his rule was basically non-existent. They were the Yamada people and he was their god. All other people were infidels and barbarians. This is why when Japan surrendered to the USA, the Japanese emperor was forced to do what is known as the Humanity Declaration to announce that he was in fact mortal, and the Japanese people were not a superior race. It was crucial to the effort to demilitarize Japan. What's even more interesting is that most of Japan's actions leading up to W2 were desperate attempts to bring themselves up to par with the Soviet Union, who they saw as an existential threat. But in doing so, they ended up alienating themselves from the West, which led them right into the end camp. So much loss and inhumane actions could have been avoided if the West and Japan were more willing to cooperate pre-war. It's thanks to the horrific experiments that happened on prisoners in Dachau camp that we know the limits of pressure, temperature, and other environmental factors a human body can sustain. Thanks to this knowledge, NASA was able to develop their space suits faster. Half of NASA was originally made up of scientists. And to be fair, at least one of them has truly contributed to the future. Werner von Braun supposedly said something along the lines of the rocket worked perfectly, except it landed on the wrong planet without him. We likely wouldn't have reached space in the 60s. Japanese officers would test their swords on captured American airmen. A veteran I knew personally wrote about some friends who went missing after their B-25 was shot down on a strafing mission. Later, it was revealed they were used as bayonet practice after capture. When they learned their fate, they asked to be shot instead. Each man was bayoneted by a member of the Japanese infantry squad for a total around 25 times. Other men were beheaded. When the Japanese invaded northeast India, the captured Indian POW were used as target practice. They did the exact same thing to the Chinese. They were in China chastising the population a few years before the war officially started. Oil is still leaking from the oil bunkers of the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor to this day. How is there that much oil? Not as much that much oil, but instead small fracture where it just leaks very slowly, is my best guess. But it also makes me wonder why they don't just either pump it out or clog the fissure. They've tried. Some of the larger tanks have been emptied, but she's only losing about 2 liters a day. There's also the problem that some of the tanks are very hard to access without disturbing the wreck. She's a war grave for over 1,000 people after all, and very fragile now, and some of them are completely inaccessible. True story about a boy whose entire family is slaughtered by the NS. Little kid manages to escape into the woods, is found starving days later by Russian soldiers, gets treated well, becomes a beloved part of the Corps. A Red Army officer at age 12, serves in battle by carrying ammunition, uncovers end spy campaigns, dances and sings cute little songs to his fellow soldiers to improve morale, gets blown up, saves a major general who later adopts him into his family, survives the war, becomes a civil rights lawyer, is totally badass. Q? The world's nations didn't want their Jews back. They had already moved into their houses and businesses after all. The murder of Jews continued well after WWI ended and Germany fell. This is one of the biggest factors leading to 40% of Israel's Jews having European ancestry. Yeah, this was especially bad in Poland. Learned about that in a college course. Jews returning to their homes after all that chaos, only to find the Polish moved in. Some were killed on the spot. Terrible.